My father, Frankie, threw a glass of red wine directly onto my dress whites, leaving a stain of humiliation across my medals, then hissed, "You're nothing but a crude hired soldier. I am willing to burn your entire life to the ground so I can die with Colonel's insignia on my coffin." He dropped a $5 bill onto the floor. "That's your tip for tonight's service. Now get out." I did not bend down to pick it up. I stood straight, feeling the dark liquid soaking through the fabric of my uniform, running down along my spine. Both hands rested flat on the navy blue folder, hard-pressed, matte laminated, sitting parallel to the edge of the wooden table without a single millimeter of deviation. I did not look at Frankie. I did not look at my mother, who was kneeling down to wipe Mark's shoes. I only watched the wine stain drying on my left chest. My father believed in the promises of a man who had just finished serving his prison sentence. But he did not know that the emergency asset freeze order I had just activated had already begun its countdown. "My name is Madison. If this cruelty made your chest tighten, hit the like button so I know you're standing on the same side as me. Now, let me take you back to the moment I walked through the doors of the Sterling, where the stage had already been set. The wine had dried to a dark crescent along the left side of my chest by the time I walked through the doors of the Sterling. Not fully dry, still tacky at the center, where the fabric had pulled tight against my medals. I could feel it with each breath, a stiffness that had nothing to do with the uniform's starch. I did not look down at it. I walked into the room the way I walked onto the flight deck of a carrier in open ocean. Eyes forward, weight distributed evenly across both heels, spine holding its own geometry without any assistance from my will. The Sterling's main hall was lit by 3 chandeliers, each one throwing a wide cone of gold light onto the long tables below. White silk tablecloths, crystal stemware that caught the light and fractured it into small, irrelevant rainbows. The smell of dry-aged beef from the kitchen mixing with white lilies arranged at intervals along the far wall. I scanned from left to right, the way I had been trained to scan any unfamiliar space. Exits first, then obstructions, then personnel. 2 service doors at the far left, one partially open. A gap between the 4th and 5th tables wide enough for 2 people moving in opposite directions. The support columns wrapped in dark velvet at the room's corners, each one deep enough to swallow a standing figure completely. The serving staff stood at intervals along the perimeter, trays balanced on upturned palms, faces pointed at the middle distance. They had been told to be invisible. They were doing a reasonable job of it. I found Frankie before I found my seat. He was at the center table, already settled into the high-backed chair at the head position. One arm draped over the back of the chair beside him, his left hand resting on Mark's shoulder with the ease of a man who had never once questioned his right to claim other people's space. His crystal glass was in his right hand, the stem between his index finger and thumb, and he was rotating it slowly, the red wine catching the light as it moved. He was not looking at me. He was looking at Mark. The expression on his face was the one I had seen on base commanders when they believed the briefing was going well. That specific looseness around the jaw, that slight forward tilt of the head that communicates certainty without requiring any actual data to support it. I placed the navy blue folder on the table in front of my assigned seat. The cover was hard-pressed, the surface matte, the edges sharp and true. I positioned it parallel to the edge of the table, making one small adjustment until the alignment was exact. The chandeliers above it threw no shadow across the cover. I left my hand resting lightly on top of it and turned to look at the room again. Mark was wearing a jacket I recognized by its construction before I identified its label. Double-breasted peak lapels, the kind of structured shoulder that required a tailor's second appointment to get right. On his left wrist, at the edge of his cuff, I could see the Omega Seamaster that had belonged to my grandfather, the serial number partially obscured by the band clasp. I noted the position of his chair relative to Frankie's. I noted the way he sat, spine rolled back slightly, weight shifted to the left hip, an arrangement that communicated comfort in exactly the way a person would arrange themselves when they believed the room already belonged to them. Frankie set his glass down and turned to look at me for the first time. He did not raise his voice. That had never been his method in public. He said, without any particular emphasis, that I should stop standing there with the face of a command machine, that Mark had shown him what the dignity of a real gentleman looked like, and that the uniform I was wearing had never purchased anything that mattered. He moved his chin toward me as he said it, a small upward angle, the kind of gesture that requires no muscle at all and lands like a flat hand. I said nothing. I moved my eyes to the space just past his right shoulder and held them there. The room had the ambient sound of cutlery being placed carefully and conversations being kept at the volume considered appropriate for wealth. I listened to it. My jaw did not move. My shoulders stayed level. Patricia was to Frankie's left, her body curved forward in its chair, her embroidered handkerchief working across the toe of Mark's right shoe, circling the same 3 square inches she had already circled twice. She did not look up. At the far end of the table, in a chair positioned slightly apart from the main arrangement, Grandmother Amber sat with both hands resting in her lap. She was 80 years old, and she had been a military nurse for 22 years, and she held her spine with the particular economy of someone who had learned long ago to conserve every movement for the moments that required them. She was watching the room. Her cloth bag was on the floor beside her right foot, its top folded down, its contents invisible. I registered her presence and returned my attention to the front of the room. Then Mark stood. He straightened his jacket with 2 fingers on each lapel, and he walked toward Grandmother Amber with a sheaf of yellow documents held loosely in one hand, his expression arranged into something that resembled respect. He spoke to her about legacy. He spoke about responsibility. He used both words more than once. She received the documents without changing her expression, and she set them on the table beside her water glass without looking at them. Mark turned on his way back and stopped when he reached me. He leaned in, close enough that I could identify the fragrance, something expensive, something that had been purchased for him. And he said, quietly and with the precision of someone who had practiced the line, that he would like to teach me about the real meaning of honor, Major. I heard the word land in the space between us. Something in my left ear canal shifted. A small change in pressure, the kind that precedes the sound of an engine fault at altitude. The smell of cold machine oil came first. Then the alarm tone. Then the basement. The word was still moving through the air when Mark turned back toward the center of the room and took his position under the largest of the 3 chandeliers. The space opened for him the way space opens for people who have rehearsed their entrance. 50 guests in evening clothes shifted their attention without being asked. The conversation at the nearer tables slowed and then stopped. I remained in my chair. The navy blue folder was under my left hand. Mark had a voice that had been trained somewhere. Not formally, but through the kind of extended practice that comes from years of needing to be believed. There was a deliberate warmth to it, a low resonance that suggested authority without demanding it directly. He moved around the perimeter of the head table as he spoke, his Italian shoes making no sound on the carpet. His hands opened outward as he gestured, palms up, a posture that reads as candor to most rooms. He stopped behind Frankie's chair and rested one hand on the chair back, and the image that created, the 2 of them in that formation, the older man seated and the younger one standing, was clearly something they had arranged in advance. He began with the family. He spoke about legacy with the fluency of someone who had studied the word but had not lived inside it. He described the fund, he called it a family investment vehicle, as something that had been allowed to stagnate under management that lacked vision. He let that phrase sit for a moment before he moved past it. He said that the $250,000 under its current arrangements was a number sitting on a bench while the game was being played without it, but that under his management, it would become the foundation of a restored family name. He smiled when he said restored. It was a careful smile, controlled at the corners. Frankie nodded at each sentence the way a person nods when they have heard a thing they wanted to hear confirmed out loud. His glass went up after the restored family name line, a slight raise in the direction of no one in particular, and he looked at me from across the table with his lower lip pushed out in the specific configuration that meant he was waiting for me to show that I understood how this worked. I did not show him anything. I was listening to the logical sequence of what Mark was saying and running a parallel accounting. Error 1. He had referenced the power of attorney as permanent and uncontested, which meant he had not read the amendment filed 14 months ago. Or he had read it and was hoping no one else in the room had. Error 2. The phrase under its current arrangements assumed that the current arrangements were what he believed them to be, and they were not. Error 3. The growth projections on the documents he had distributed to the nearby tables used a compounding model that did not match the account type it was applied to. The kind of error that is invisible to anyone who has not spent time inside the actual structure of the account. I noted the way Mark adjusted the second button of his jacket when he mentioned the 250,000. A small compression of the fingers, a slight inward pull. People do this when they are presenting a number that they know is not correctly represented by their framing. It is a self-soothing gesture. It is also, under certain definitions, a tell. He moved to the second line of attack without pausing between them. He turned to Patricia, and his voice dropped a register, and he described, with something that was meant to resemble sorrow, a daughter too accustomed to the mechanics of destruction to understand what it meant to build something lasting. He lingered on the phrase service to the country, giving it a quality that turned it sideways from its dictionary meaning into something closer to limitation. He did not look at me when he said it. That was intentional. Looking at me would have acknowledged my presence as a participant. He was describing me the way someone describes an obstacle, not a person. Patricia applauded with her fingertips, a light, repeated contact between her hands that she performed while watching Mark's face. Frankie drank. The guests at the adjacent tables made sounds of consideration. I kept my left hand flat on the cover of the folder. I watched the line of Mark's shoulders as he walked. I watched the way the omega on his wrist caught the light each time his arm moved, and I read the serial number in the half-second intervals when the angle permitted it. The number matched the record I had looked at 11 days ago. Then Mark drew himself up and delivered the conclusion. He told the room, with the steadiness of a man announcing something that had already been decided, that the honor of the Torres name would be formally secured by the end of the current month, when Frankie would be recognized with an honorary colonel's commission through connections that Mark had spent years cultivating. He looked at the room when he said it, not at Frankie, because the line was for the room. Then he turned and said the word loyal, and said it with finality. And Frankie laughed and brought his glass down against the table hard enough that the wine jumped its rim and left a new mark on the white silk. And he looked at me with the expression of a man who believed the room had just confirmed something. I felt the word reach the left side of my face before it reached any other part of me. Not the sound of it, the temperature of it. The hair along my left temple pulled tight. Something behind my back molars pressed upward, and underneath those two physical facts, arriving before either of them made sense, was the smell of damp paper and concrete and cold fluorescent light, and I was no longer entirely in the Sterling. It came in layers, the way it always did. Smell before image and image before sound. Damp concrete. The particular cold of a basement that does not receive sun on any side of the house. Then the light. A single incandescent bulb on a cord, swinging slightly because Frankie had slammed the door coming down the stairs, and the swing had not fully stopped. I was 20 years old. I was on my knees on the cement floor, and the floor was cold through the fabric of my jeans, and there were torn pieces of paper around me, some of them charred at the edges, some of them whole enough to still be readable. The documents in the aluminum bowl were burning with a low, steady flame. I had tried to pull 2 of them out before he noticed, and I had gotten one. The one I saved had the court-martial heading at the top, and a case number and a date, and I had folded it into a square and pressed it flat inside the lining of my jacket, in the seam pocket, the one that does not show. The rest were ash by then, or close enough that it did not matter. Frankie stood between me and the staircase. He had been drinking, but not enough to lose precision. That was the version of him that was most difficult to predict, the one where the alcohol had dissolved the parts of his behavior that required effort, but left the parts that were already fully formed. He held a document in his right hand, a single page with a signature line at the bottom, and the pen he was holding in his left hand had punctured the paper slightly where he had pressed too hard while waiting. He crouched down to my level. His hand closed around my chin, not hard enough to bruise, hard enough to orient my face in the direction of his. He told me to understand what loyalty meant. He said that if I did not sign the revised expense declaration, the one that would reclassify $46,000 as authorized rather than missing, I would have no pathway into the academy. None. He had contacts and he had used them to build an opening for me, and those contacts would disappear the moment he told them to. He said not to let my abstract ethics destroy the family's only viable future. He said it the way people say things they have said to themselves many times and have come to believe. The pen touched the paper where the signature line was. I looked at the line. I looked at the flame in the bowl. I looked at the burned edges of the court-martial documents, at the name printed above the case heading, at the number of the fiscal year, at the branch designation. I looked at all of it, and then I picked up the pen. Above me, from the direction of the kitchen, the sound of the television increased suddenly. A game show, something with a studio audience. And then Patricia's footsteps moved across the floor in the direction away from the basement door. Then back. Then the door opened 6 inches and a hand appeared and dropped a handkerchief through the gap. She said, from behind the door without opening it further, that I should listen to my father because this was how we kept peace in the family. Then the door closed again. The handkerchief landed on the floor beside the burning bowl. The corner of it caught a small ember, and I watched it smoke for a second before it went out on its own. A fork struck a porcelain plate somewhere to my right, and the sterling came back in one piece. The chandeliers. The smell of dry-aged beef and lilies. The white silk tablecloth with the new wine mark near Frankie's place setting. I was 35 years old. I was sitting in a chair with a straight spine and 2 hands resting flat on a hard-pressed navy blue folder, and the folder contained, among other things, a clean photocopy of the document I had saved in the seam pocket of my jacket 15 years ago. I looked at Mark. He was still standing at the center of the room, receiving the room's attention with the comfort of someone who had not yet encountered a reason to be uncomfortable. I looked at his wrist. I looked at the omega. The memory did not dissolve. It settled into the lower register of my breathing and stayed there, changing the quality of the air coming into my lungs without restricting it. I had spent 15 years carrying the weight of that signed declaration as though the weight itself were the point. It had taken 4 more years to understand that the point was what I had built on the other side of it, in the space Frankie had never thought to monitor. I placed my palms flat on the table. Grandmother Amber gave me one slight nod from the far end. Not encouragement, not permission. A recognition. I began to apply the pressure required to bring my body to standing. The legs of my chair moved across the carpet with a sound that was not loud but was distinct, and in the specific quiet that followed Mark's conclusion, it carried. I did not push myself up from the arms of the chair. I used the muscles of my thighs and the alignment of my pelvis, the way I had learned to stand on a flight deck that was moving. One motion. Continuous. I was upright before anyone in the room had time to anticipate it. I stood still. The chandeliers were above and slightly behind me, and the light fell across the front of my uniform. The wine stain was visible. I did not look at it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I let the silence hold for 5 full counted seconds, one for each person in the immediate cluster of Frankie, Mark, Patricia, and the 2 nearest guests, and I watched the room recalibrate around the fact of my standing. Then I said Mark's name, and the room heard it. I told him I wanted to return to the word he had used, loyal, because where I came from, loyal did not describe the act of forging a signature on a mortgage lien document at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday. I said that specifically. The time, the day, the document type. I said it without raising my pitch or altering my pace, the way I read technical discrepancy logs after a maintenance review, giving each piece of information its exact weight and no additional weight beyond that. Mark's right hand moved toward the crystal glass on the table near him. His fingers found the stem, and then the glass slid against the edge of the plate, a sound that went through the nearest table and stopped the conversation there. He did not pick it up. His hand remained on the stem, and I watched the tendons in his forearm adjust as he tried to settle the contact. He was looking at a point approximately 6 inches to my left. He had stopped looking at me directly the moment I mentioned the specific time. Frankie leaned forward in his chair, both hands going to the armrests, and I saw his jaw tighten. He began to speak. Something about legal arrangements, something about the structure of family decisions, and Grandmother Amber said his name once from the far end of the table, and he stopped. Not because she raised her voice, because she said it with the weight of someone who had been waiting a specific amount of time for a specific moment, and the moment had arrived, and everyone in the room understood that from the sound of it. I kept my eyes on Mark. I told him that the figure he had described as sitting on a bench was not sitting anywhere. I told him it had been frozen at the institutional level for 9 days. I watched his throat work. I watched the skin below his left ear change color in a way that has nothing to do with the will of the person it belongs to. Patricia had stopped moving. The handkerchief was balled in her fist on the table, and her shoulders had come up and forward in the way that happens when the body is attempting to make itself smaller without the conscious participation of the person inside it. I did not look at her. I reached down and tapped 3 times on the cover of the navy blue folder with the first 2 fingers of my right hand, 3 clean contacts, and the sound was absorbed by the room's carpeting into something almost inaudible. Almost. The people closest to me heard it. Before I tell you what I took out of that folder, I want to stop for just a moment. If you have ever had to stand up inside a room that had already decided which version of you to believe, and you stood up anyway, please hit the like button. I want to know you are there. And if you have ever been the person in that room who no one thought to ask, drop a word in the comments. I read everything. Now, let me tell you what I put on that table. I opened the cover of the folder. The Velcro seal parted with a sound that went through the nearest 12 feet of the room like a word spoken at the exact wrong moment. I reached inside and my fingers found the first document. I drew it out slowly, holding it by the top corner, and I slid it across the white silk tablecloth toward Grandmother Amber. It crossed the distance between us and came to rest against the edge of her water glass. The paper was white. The bank seal in the upper left corner was printed in a deep red, exactly the same red as the stain on the left side of my chest, and Frankie was looking at it from across the table with an expression that had not yet decided what it was going to be. The bank seal sat in the center of the table's attention for the span of several seconds before anyone moved. Mark recovered first, or tried to. He produced a sound that was shaped like a laugh, short and dry, and he turned toward Frankie with the practiced ease of someone redirecting a conversation that had gone slightly off the intended track. He said that what Madison was presenting was a temporary technical matter. He used the phrase twice in 3 sentences. He said that Frankie held full and uncontested authority under the terms of the permanent delegation that had been filed. And here, he used the legal phrasing in a way that was technically adjacent to accurate, but required the listener to not know what the amendment to that filing had modified. He adjusted the omega on his wrist as he said permanent delegation, his thumb pressing briefly against the crown. The same small anchoring gesture I had noted during his earlier remarks about the 250,000. Frankie brought his fist down against the table. Not his palm, his fist, the knuckle side, and the impact sent the crystal stemware into contact with each other in a sharp, unanimous complaint across that section of the table. He said the word ungrateful, with the momentum of someone who had kept it loaded for a long time. He called me a saboteur of my own family's survival. He moved to stand, and the chair's legs caught on the carpet edge, and he grabbed Mark's shoulder to correct his balance, the grip of a man who needed the contact to be interpreted as authority rather than support. Mark received it without reaction. I noted the absence of reaction. I moved my hand to the folder. The second document was behind the first, tabbed separately. I withdrew it the way I withdrew any physical evidence in a formal review, by the upper corner, without pressure on the printed surface, oriented so that the text faced the appropriate direction before it landed. I set it on top of the bank seal document and let both of them rest on the silk for one complete breath before I began to speak. I read the date of the first transaction. I read the merchant name. I read the dollar amount, $3,520, charged to a card issued in my name, at a tailor's address in a city I had not visited in over a year. I read the next line. A secondary charge at the same location 6 weeks later, listed as alterations, $280. I read the date of the third transaction. A different merchant, a watchmaker on the eastern side of the same city, where a service and authentication had been performed on a Seamaster model, 1968, stainless steel with a black face. I read the charge amount. I read the date. I looked up from the paper and let my eyes rest on the omega on Mark's wrist for one count before I moved them back to the document. I kept my voice at the level I used for technical debriefs. Enough volume to reach the back of the room. No additional force beyond what clarity required. The room did not need my emotion. The room needed the dates and the amounts, which were doing work that emotion would have interfered with. Mark's right hand moved to his collar. His index finger went between the fabric and his neck and pulled, a small release of pressure. He had stopped looking at me and started looking at the centerpiece arrangement midway down the table. His mouth was partially open, and the muscles at his jaw hinge were working, the way they work when someone is running a calculation about whether the next thing they say will help or make things substantially worse. Frankie had sat back down. The color in his face had migrated upward, past red, into something that sat at the base of the ears and the bridge of the nose. He was reading the documents from where he sat, his chin pulled down, his eyes moving across the lines of the statements with the careful attention of a man who is trying to find the error in a document rather than accepting that the document is accurate. Grandmother Amber put her glasses on. They were the kind with half lenses set in a thin wire frame, and she held the nearest document up slightly from the table surface and began reading from the top, taking her time with each line. The room was quiet enough that I could hear the faint slide of her rings against the paper as she held it. She set it down. She folded her glasses along the arm and held them in her left hand. She looked at me across the length of the table and she asked, in a voice consistent with someone who had assessed a great many injuries in very poor lighting conditions, how it was that I had access to account documentation of this category. The kind that a standard branch inquiry would not produce. I brought my heels together, a small, contained movement, and I began to give her the answer. The question sat in the room for the exact number of seconds it takes for a room to understand that what is about to be said will reorder what it already knows. Mark had opened his mouth. He had produced the beginning shape of a word. Something that would have been about relationships with people in positions that could contextualize what I was presenting as something other than what it was. My eyes moved to his, and he closed his mouth without finishing the word. I did not say anything to make that happen. The look was enough. I turned back to Grandmother Amber. I told her that I held the position of Technical Security Command Officer for the Pacific Fleet Naval Command. I said it at the same volume and pace as everything else I had said in the last 8 minutes. Then I stopped talking. The silence after that sentence had a different quality than the silence that had preceded it. Mark's fork left his hand. It fell from approximately the height of the table edge and struck the marble floor below, and the sound it made went through the room like a crack in something that had been under sustained pressure. He did not move to retrieve it. His eyes were on me with an expression I recognized from very different contexts. The expression of someone who has just understood that the terrain they believed they were moving through is not the terrain they are actually standing in. Frankie's shoulders dropped. Not gradually, at once, a structural change, as if the thing that had been holding them at their previous elevation had been removed. He looked at the rank insignia on my left shoulder, and then he looked at my face, and for the first time in this room, possibly for the first time in a significant number of years, he was looking at me without the overlay of whatever he had decided I was when I was much younger. The recognition that crossed his face was not pride. It was the specific disorientation of a man who has been making calculations about a variable that turned out to be something entirely other than what he had entered into the equation. Grandmother Amber removed her glasses from her hand and set them beside her water glass. The change in her expression was not large. A slight settling around the eyes, a fractional release of something that had been held in careful suspension. She looked at me the way she had looked at my grandfather in the photographs from his deployment, the ones she kept in the cloth bag under her chair. I reached into the interior section of the folder, the pocket behind the divider, and I placed a laminated identification card on the table beside the bank documents. The Department of Defense emblem was in the upper left. My photograph was to the right of the emblem. Below the photograph, in the category line, the text read, Technical Security Command Officer, Pacific Fleet, and below that was the grade designation and the security clearance level. I positioned it parallel to the edge of the nearest document and left it there under the chandelier light. I told the room that the freeze order bearing my authorization number had been processed 9 days prior through a channel available to my office under standing protocol, and that the process had been initiated based on documentation of unauthorized account access occurring over 14 months. I told them that the review had produced records of 41 transactions across 3 separate accounts, each one traceable through institutional timestamps to a device registered in Mark's name at an address that was not the address on any document Frankie had filed in connection with the family account arrangement. I said all of this at the level and pace of a technical summary. Mark was watching the secondary service exit at the far end of the hall. He had turned a quarter of the way in that direction, a partial rotation of his body toward the route, the kind of movement that is not yet escape, but is the body beginning to calculate whether escape is viable. He had not finished the calculation because the 2 members of Sterling's security staff that I had spoken with 40 minutes before my arrival were standing at that exit. He saw them at the same moment that I registered him looking. There was a moment then when Frankie lifted his hand from the table and extended it slightly in my direction. His fingers were open. The gesture had the shape of someone reaching to touch the arm of a person they need to reach before that person moves away. I stepped back 1 centimeter, a small, clean withdrawal, and his hand completed its arc in the empty air between us and came back to rest against the tablecloth. His eyes were on the identification card. He was reading the title line again. I watched the point when the words resolved into their correct meaning for him, the moment when the grade designation stopped being a label and became something he had not prepared for. Grandmother Amber reached down beside her chair and lifted the cloth bag into her lap. She looked at me over the top of it. Then she looked at the folder, then back at me. She said, very quietly, that she believed I had one more thing to show the room. The last document was behind a piece of archival tissue paper, the kind used to protect materials that cannot be replaced. My fingers found the edge of it in the dark of the interior pocket, and I drew it out with both hands, holding it flat, not folding it at any point during the removal. It was legal size. The paper yellowed at the margins to a shade that was not uniform, darker at the edges where air and time had done more work. The print was typewriter ink, the characters slightly uneven in the way that mechanical keys produced before the standardization of electronic composition. I set it on the table above the other documents, oriented so that the text faced the room. I smoothed the single fold at the center with 2 fingers, then withdrew my hands and placed them flat on the table surface on either side of the page. The chandelier above did what I needed it to do. Frankie saw the heading before he read anything else. The heading was 4 lines. Branch designation, date, case file number. And below that, in capital letters of a size selected to ensure legibility at document reproduction scale. Determination of misconduct, fraudulent appropriation of command funds. He read the heading, and then he read the date, and then something happened to the architecture of his face that was not anger and was not grief, and was in the specific register of a person confronting an artifact they believed they had destroyed. I began to read. I did not increase my volume. I read the finding paragraph first, which specified the dollar amount, $46,218, and the classification of the misuse, and the name of the commanding officer who had signed the determination. Then I read the co-signatories. There were 2 names below the commanding officers. The second name on the co-signatory list was the surname that Mark shared. Frankie stood up. He did not use the chair arms to assist himself this time. He brought both fists down on the table simultaneously, and the crystal stemware went up and came down, and 1 glass tipped fully, and the wine remaining in it went across the silk in a wide, irregular arc. He said, in a voice that no longer had anything to do with the calibrated register he had used at the beginning of the evening, that I had kept it, that I had held it like something hidden all this time, that I had waited until this room and this night to produce it, and that after everything he had given me, the word everything was where his voice cracked for the first time, not from emotion but from the failure of the breath to sustain the syllable. I had chosen to put him in front of everyone he had built his standing with. He called me ungrateful again. He called me a hired instrument with no allegiance to anything that mattered. He said the uniform was a costume for people who had no understanding of what family required. The vein along the left side of his neck was visible from where I stood. His hands were shaking, not trembling, shaking, the kind that comes from the failure of the muscles to continue performing the task of containment. I did not step back. I did not raise my voice to match his. I looked at the document in front of me and I finished reading the last paragraph of the determination, which included the formal notation that the case had been sealed under a filing agreement that would lapse upon the filing of a subsequent petition, a petition that had been filed 31 days ago by my office as an ancillary action to the account freeze. I set the page down. I looked at the room. Mark had moved behind Frankie's chair. Not beside him. Behind him, with 2 additional inches of distance between his body and Frankie's back than there had been at the beginning of the evening. He had removed his hand from the chair back. He was very still, the kind of still that is the result of a conscious decision not to produce any movement that might direct attention back in his direction. The 2 men from Sterling's security team had moved from the secondary exit to a position inside the room. Patricia had her face against the folded white of her handkerchief. Her shoulders were moving in a small, continuous rhythm. Grandmother Amber rose to her feet. She used both hands on the table edge, a slow, deliberate extension of her body to full height, and she did not rush any part of it. The room watched her stand the way a room watches an event it has been oriented toward without knowing it. When she was standing, she was not tall, but the quality of her stillness took up the space that height would have taken in a different person. She looked at Frankie for a long moment. She looked at Mark. She did not look at them in the way one looks at people one is about to address. She looked at them the way one looks at something one is cataloging for future reference. Then she said Frankie's name. And then she began to speak. Grandmother Amber did not consult the documents. She did not need to. She spoke for 4 minutes, and in those 4 minutes she named 3 things: the house on Carver Street, which she had held in trust since my grandfather's death, and which she was formally redirecting into a preservation instrument bearing my name effective the following business day. The $250,000 in the Torres family account, which remained frozen under my authorization, and which would remain frozen pending the outcome of the institutional review. And the matter of Frankie's honorary commission, which she noted had never been a realistic possibility, and which Mark had represented as such to obtain Frankie's cooperation. She said each of these things in the same voice she had used to ask me her question: organized, complete, without ornamentation. Frankie sat in his chair while she spoke. He had stopped trying to stand. His crystal glass had tipped, and the last of the wine was running along the seam of the tablecloth toward the table's edge, and he was watching it move without appearing to see it. His hands were open on the armrests, the fingers no longer making any effort to grip. The red in his face had begun the process of withdrawal, pulling back from the outer surfaces, leaving the center of his nose and the space beneath his eyes at a different shade than the rest of his skin. I stood beside Grandmother Amber's chair and I watched Patricia. She came toward me along the far side of the table, moving around the guests who had not yet cleared their chairs, her steps uneven on the carpet. She held the handkerchief against her mouth with one hand. When she reached me, she stopped, and she put her other hand up, and then stopped before it contacted my arm and let it remain in the air between us. She said that she had not known. That she had not known what Mark was. That she had only wanted Frankie to have something he could be proud of in the years he had left, and she was sorry. And she asked me a question with a word at the end of it that she had never before applied directly to me in this context. I listened to her. I noted the specific texture of her voice when she said the word. Not rehearsed, not the product of strategy, the product of a woman who had spent 30 years managing the distance between what she knew and what she could afford to acknowledge, and who had arrived, finally, at the precise cost of that management. I reached into the inner breast pocket of my uniform jacket. My fingers found what I had placed there before leaving my apartment that morning. A single key on a plain steel ring, no identifying tags. I set it into her open palm and closed her fingers around it. I told her the address on the card attached to the key was a furnished unit in a building with a 24-hour staffed entrance. I told her it was in her name, as of that morning. I told her that no one else had a key. She looked at the ring for a moment, then at me. And then she made the sound that people make when they have been holding their breath for a very long time and have finally been given permission to stop. From the far end of the hall, 2 men in plain clothes came through the service entrance and crossed to where Mark was standing. The first spoke to him in a low voice. Mark did not respond immediately. He looked at the identification one of them held, and then he looked at me once, briefly. And there was nothing in that look that resembled the expression he had worn when he leaned in and told me he wanted to teach me about honor. He extended his wrists. I watched him walk through the room and out the service exit in the jacket I had paid for. The omega was still on his wrist when he passed through the door. Someone would address that through the appropriate process. That was not my task tonight. I turned to Grandmother Amber and gave her one nod. She returned it without smiling. I picked up the navy blue folder from the table, tucked it under my left arm, and walked toward the hall. Behind me, Frankie said my name. His voice had the quality of something that had been used at full capacity and was now operating at reduced function. I did not stop. The sound of my heels on the marble at the hall entrance was the sound of a clean interval of time beginning. The corridor that ran from the main hall to Sterling's front entrance was lit by wall-mounted fixtures set at half their rated output, and the effect was a light that illuminated the path without requiring the walls. The carpet here was narrower than in the reception hall, the pattern finer, the sound of footsteps absorbed almost entirely. I had gone perhaps 30 feet when I saw him. Frankie was standing against the left wall, in the space between the second and third fixtures, wearing the jacket he had put on in 1987 for a photograph that used to be on the hallway table at the house on Carver Street. The jacket had been preserved in the way that things are preserved when they are never worn again but cannot be given away. The shoulders sat at the wrong angle. His hands were at his sides. His eyes were watching my feet as I came toward him, not my face. I maintained my pace. The folder was under my left arm. The distance between us decreased at a steady rate. When I was close enough for him to speak at a normal volume, he spoke. He said, "Please first," which was not a word he had used with me often or recently. He said that I could not leave him there, not like that, not with all of them having seen it. He said that Mark had misled him, that he had believed in something that turned out to be constructed from false materials, and that this was not entirely a thing he had done alone. He said that I had power. He said I was a commanding officer, as though the fact of it had just become real to him in the last 12 minutes, and that I could use that to preserve what remained of the name, of the house, of whatever could still be salvaged from the evening. He said he did not want to die in the way he was currently heading toward dying, which was the way that ends without anyone standing near the bed. I stopped. One step past the point where stopping would have looked unintentional. I turned my head and looked at him, and I took in the full visual fact of him. The jacket, the hands, the way his chest was moving with the specific irregularity of a person who has been crying recently and has stopped, but has not fully returned to normal respiration. I told him that he had not failed because of Mark. I told him that he had failed because he had made the deliberate choice to burn my life down in exchange for a set of insignia that was never going to be placed on any coffin by any legitimate authority, and that the two things were not the same failure, even though they had arrived at the same address. I said it the way I would have said it in a formal review. The facts of the situation, the causal chain, the designation of responsibility. Clear, sufficient, not unkind, and not kind. Then I turned back toward the door at the end of the corridor. He said something after I turned. Several things. They contained the word cold and the word machine, and a specific kind of prediction about what my life would produce in the absence of family. I heard all of it. My pace did not change. The words reached me and continued past me the way wind moves past a fixed structure, and the structure does not move, because that is what fixed means. The door at the end of the corridor was a pair of oak panels, each one with a vertical brass handle. I placed a hand on each handle and pushed outward, and the seal broke, and the night came in all at once. Temperature, pressure, the smell of salt water and pavement and cold that had nothing in it that belonged to the Sterling. The air found the damp fabric on my chest, and the stain there pulled tight, and then released as I exhaled. I stood on the top step. I took one breath. I did not turn around. The parking area was lit by sodium vapor lamps on tall poles that threw a pale orange across the asphalt, and my car was where I had left it, 6 rows from the entrance, nothing between it and me but open ground. I went down the 3 steps and I crossed the pavement and I got in, and I started the engine and the instrumentation lit up in sequence, everything returning its ready status in the order it was designed to. I pulled out of the lot and onto the coast road, and the ocean appeared on my right, black and moving, the light from the far shore breaking across it in long horizontal lines. If you could go back to a room like that, not to change what happened, not to make someone understand something they had already decided not to understand, but just to let your own voice be the last sound you heard before you walked out, what would that voice say? Leave it in the comments. I will read every one of them. And if this story gave you something tonight that you needed, there is another one waiting for you below this one, and I think you already know which kind of story it is. The city fell away behind me. The road curved north, following the coastline, and the headlights showed only the next section of it, and then the next. Somewhere behind me, In a corridor paneled in dark wood, the sound of Frankie's voice had already reached the end of itself. The harbor lights appeared on the right, and beyond them, at anchor, the ship was exactly where it was supposed to be. And I drove toward it without looking at anything in the mirror.